Hey guys, Max92, welcome to another tryout. Today's tryout is Metroid II Return of Samus versus Metroid Samus Returns. So you may or may not know this if you're already watching it, but Metroid II Return of Samus was a game that came out on the original Game Boy, and Metroid Samus Returns was a remake of Metroid II, but for the 3DS. Like a full ground-up remake, new everything pretty much. And so I figured I would do a little side-by-side type of video, because I hadn't really played either of them, and I'd recently picked up Samus Returns from a GameStop I paid probably a little bit too much for, and this is, I believe, a physical copy that comes with the collector's edition. It's got like a not-for-resale on the back and stuff. I was planning on playing Metroid 2 after having finished Metroid Fusion, which I did a live stream playthrough of. I believe I'll throw together a playlist, and you can click that and watch that if you're interested. And so that means that, like, at this point I've played two or three full Metroid games. I think it might just be two, Super Metroid and Metroid Fusion. And I've played through most of the original game on the Game Boy Advance at one point. I figured the next game I'd do was Metroid 2, and maybe Samus Returns afterwards, or in some combination do those two games before going on to Dread, once I finally get around to getting that. And so, to start for talking today, let's start talking about Metroid 2 Return of Samus. As I already mentioned, this is an OG Game Boy game, and I don't know if you played a lot of Game Boy platformers, but because of the screen size, they tend to be a little bit slower than some of the other ones because of like how close you are to the character and stuff like that. And this is a relatively slow game. I mean, Metroid games, at least traditionally, aren't like the fastest until you get far enough in to get like certain upgrades and whatnot. So they're a bit slower and plodding, and I think it generally works in the game's favor for like the atmosphere and vibe. My main issue, I think, that I've had so far with Metroid 2 is that it's pretty aimless. I mean, the first Metroid game is also a bit aimless, but you sort of like get the idea of like you're supposed to go do a thing over here. You find things where it's like, okay, I've run into a wall here, I can't seem to do anything, so I must go a different way and go this. But it seems like Metroid 2 is a lot more non-linear in the way that you can take these things. So it's like, there are just Metroids dotted about that you need to go and kill all, I think, like 40, and then you leave, I assume. And it's just very like, alright, go. Alright, go. That's it. That's all you really get. It doesn't really point you anywhere. It's just a lot of wandering, finding new areas, finding things. And I think this one probably you'll need a map to really get through. Just like pull up like an online map and use that to sort of figure out where things are and where you're supposed to be trying to go. I guess like the ideal would maybe be to draw your own map while you play, so that like you can have a map, but also like you don't get the spoilers of where items are and whatnot. But it's really just like, how long do you want to take to play through the game? That's about it. That's really up to player choice, because I can definitely see an engagement in drawing your own map, you know, and doing it the mapping it out yourself. It's just a bit difficult, I think, with how small the screen is compared to like even NES Metroid, to just like figure out where you are sometimes. Everything looks pretty samey from what I've played. It's just a bit like, it just feels very aimless. I'd say that it's a little hard to come back to after having played more recent Metroid games, especially Super Metroid, which like really like nails down what the formula is, and Metroid Fusion, which is a great like simplification of what Metroid has come to be in the time since the first game. So like, it's a bit hard to go back to this one in particular, because I feel like even the NES game is a lot easier to come back to, though that might just be the fact that I grew up playing it on the Game Boy Advance cartridge. Something that really is in favor of this game, though, is how accessible it is, just being on the base Nintendo Switch Online service under the Game Boy application thing. It's just in there, and you can play it if you have Nintendo Switch Online, which is only $20 a year. It's not like a particularly expensive subscription. So if you have a Nintendo Switch, you probably have a Nintendo Switch Online, and you probably can play this. So it's really easy to get to and really easy to check out. I'd say probably play the first game first, but I do think that there is a perspective that you gain having played this one as well, and sort of seeing this other, like, I wouldn't even call it like a black sheep necessarily, but it's the Game Boy one, you know? It's the one that came out on the Game Boy, and there's not a lot of Metroid games. So eventually, if you play through enough of them, you're eventually going to have to come back to it, and it's probably best that you do this one early on, because some of the things that come to be in the later games, you come back to this, and it's like, oh, okay. It just feels very simple, and so it's definitely better off to not play like Super Metroid or Metroid Fusion before you get to this one. But I do think, like, I want to see what it does that's unique. Just seeing the things that it does with the limitations of the Game Boy, you know, at the time. That's interesting enough for me to be like, yeah, I'd say I passed this. Really just due to its accessibility, the, you know, importance kind of in it being just the second Metroid game, and in sort of like the uniqueness of it being the Metroid game that came out on the Game Boy. There's like an interest there to even just check it out. So I'd say, I think I said already pass it, and say that that's about what I had to say about it. So we'll move on to the next game, which is obviously Metroid Samus Returns. But before that, I forgot to mention, I did not play this on the 3DS. This is here just for like visual aid. I played Metroid II on the Switch through an NSO. You can probably tell by my footage that I played it on the Switch via Nintendo Switch Online, because it doesn't have a 3DS border on it, but just wanted to say that out loud because I forgot to mention it anywhere else. But yeah, Metroid Samus Returns. There's a lot of new things in this, like pretty much right off the bat. There's just like a lot more direction, there's a map, there's new like mechanics that I don't remember what they're called, but like there's full new mechanics. Seems like there's a totally different like path through the game. Seems like they've maybe redesigned the map a bit. It's just sort of like a full remake, to the point where these are different experiences, you know? There's a lot more in regards to like player direction and like leading the player places like more intentionally than just having the player wander and explore through a space that doesn't have a lot of direction. That sort of leads the game to feel more streamlined, even though I don't think I got quite as far in terms of like killing the 40 Metroids as I did in Metroid 2, just wandering around. I'd say in part that the vibe is a little off. It's very bright and very colorful, and it doesn't really have the sort of like foreboding vibe that I'd say that the original Metroid, and to an extent Metroid 2, has. It's supposed to feel a bit inhospitable, a bit hostile, and I'd say the game overall doesn't really give me that vibe. I don't feel like I'm struggling like at any point in Samus Returns, whereas in Metroid 2, like the lack of resources and stuff, like I'm at a point I think in that game where I'm pretty low on health, and I'm sort of stuck pretty low on health. It's harder to get health items and get health back than it is in Samus Returns. So definitely an easier, more accessible in terms of like play style type of game. And speaking to that, like more accessibility, I haven't felt the need to look anything up so far. There's a map in game, as I mentioned. It's just sort of like the game tells you pretty clearly where you're supposed to be going, kind of what you're supposed to be doing. It doesn't feel like there's a lot to go out and explore too far from the path that they're taking you on, in terms of like hitting, this is where the Metroids are, go get them, you know, sort of thing. But like you're blocked off from certain areas by these like DNA gates or something, where you have to like deposit the Metroids into after defeating them or something, and that's not in the original game. You're just sort of wandering, and the way that you get past these gates is basically just gaining the expected item or whatever to let you pass this wall. And that's not only the case in Samus Returns. You have this sort of like gameplay progression in terms of like actually defeating all the Metroids progression wall that you have to lower periodically to get further and further. The biggest downside, I think, to Samus Returns is the fact that it's a 3DS game, and with the 3DS eShop closing and these games largely going out of production and print and whatnot, you've just got a bunch of secondhand copies floating around. If you really want, like, to secure yourself something, there are other ways. There are other means that you can download it with, like, illegally, technically, but not everyone wants to do that. Not everyone wants to go through the process of hacking a 3DS, even though it is surprisingly easy to hack your 3DS. I did it to this one so that I could do capture off of it wirelessly, and it took me probably 20 minutes. So it's not like a difficult task, it's just sort of a task you have to do. It's another wall that you have to climb over in order to play this game. And it just makes it harder to recommend overall, in that, like, you have to either buy a 3DS and find a physical copy, or buy a 3DS and hack that 3DS, or buy a 3DS that already has it downloaded or whatever. Meanwhile, Metroid 2, I can just go pull up my Switch. I already have Nintendo Switch Online, so if you don't have a Switch, you'll have to buy a Switch. You'll have to get Nintendo Switch Online for the $20 a year it is. I don't know what it is monthly. And then you have it. You just open it on the Switch. This is modern hardware, accessible hardware that you can get at a store. You can't just walk into Walmart and buy a 3DS. So it's like, it's harder to be like, yeah, just go play Metroid Samus Returns, because it's a 3DS game and it's just sort of stuck there, unless Nintendo ports it, has someone port it to the Switch. It's a 3DS game, and that's where it's gonna sit. So I'm still gonna pass it, because I would say, from what I've played, it's very solid. There's a reason that the developers of Samus Returns were the ones brought to develop Metroid Dread. There's a lot of, like, understanding of the mechanics and stuff of this genre and how to make that all work. I just think it's maybe a bit hand-holdy, a little too linear for a Metroid game. But, like, Metroid games aren't, like, the most non-linear all the time, but, like, they're still relatively non-linear games. And so, it's pass, but those things I just said, you know? Just me some of my like, overall conclusions. This first thing is just something that I noticed from playing both games side by side. I had originally noticed it playing Samus Returns. I started with Samus Returns, and I was like, this music is a bit too, like, jaunty and dancey here for, like, the vibe that I generally expect from a Metroid game. And, like, there is some, like, more intense or more, like, driving music in the first game. It's just this music has a different vibe than what I expect. But then, you know, I played Metroid 2, and it's also in that. So it's like, I just feel like that vibe is off a little bit on that particular piece, in my opinion. And then the other thing is that, like, these games are different enough that I'd say they stand on their own. I feel like there's maybe a reason that Samus Returns isn't just called Metroid 2 Return of Samus, you know, remake. It's different. There is so much done in Samus Returns that it is, while, you know, filling the role of being a modern version of Metroid 2, it is very different to the point where these are just different games. You know, these are just almost wholly different games in the terms of, like, how they play and everything. So, like, I can recommend them both separately on their own, because they're just different enough experiences that, yeah, you're going to get something different out of playing both of these, you know? And that's really all I think I had to say about these two games today. So, get to the end bits. Go down in the description, find a beacons.ai link. You can click that. You go to my places like my Patreon, Bandcamp, Redbubble, etc. Click the links on that. Go to those places. Do what you do there. What's the next thing? Like the video if you liked it, dislike if you didn't. Subscribe if you want to keep up with this and other shows. I'm mostly doing this right now, but I'm working on other things all the time. So Sometimes there'll be other things eventually. We'll see. They'll happen when they'll happen. So subscribe if you want to see any of that. Leave a comment. What's your favorite Metroid game? Do you have an opinion on these two? Which one's better of these two, you think? I didn't really have an opinion on which one is better necessarily. I think I'm leaning towards Samus Returns, but it's more just like the modern factor of it. I don't know. Leave a comment, share the video, do the things. Anyway, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye!